Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Michelle DeMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Nadine Orenstein. Before I begin, two brief announcements, and one is if you are here for first-year experience credit, you can see me afterwards and I will scan your code. And the second is, if you're here tonight, I have to assume that you're interested in prints and you're interested in works on paper, unless you're one of my students and you had to be here. If you like paper and you're interested in hearing from a paper conservator about her perspective working on contemporary art as opposed to the Rembrandts we're going to hear about tonight, please join us on Thursday evening at 5 o'clock in the Kelly Theater in the Quick Center. The conservator, the Ellsworth Kelly conservator from the Whitney Museum of American Art, is going to be speaking about her perspective on working on contemporary art. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Nadine Orenstein, her talk forms part of the Edwin L. Weisl Lectureships in Art History, which are funded by the Robert Lehman Foundation. As many of you know, one of our exhibitions this fall is Ink and Time, European Prints from the Wetmore Collection, which was co-curated with students in a seminar in fall 2023. One of the threads that emerged from that seminar and found its way into the exhibition's wall texts was an interest in unpacking and understanding the abbreviated Latin inscriptions that often show up around the periphery of many of those prints, inscriptions that were intended to once provide an educated print consumer with an understanding of the many individuals that were involved in a particular art object's design and production and eventual sale. And I happened to read a profile of Dr. Orenstein in which she mentioned a similar curiosity arising as a graduate student studying European prints, and that led to the invitation for tonight's talk, in which she'll touch on some aspects of this broader commercial world of print in Rembrandt's time. Dr. Nadine Orenstein is the Drue Heinz Curator in charge of the Department of Drawings and Prints in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she's been active as a curator since 1992. She's written and lectured extensively on 16th and 17th century prints and drawings, and her many publications include Hendrik Hondius and the Business of Prints in 17th century Holland, and several volumes of the New Holstein Dutch and Flemish etchings, engravings, and woodcuts, 1450 to 1700. Dr. Orenstein has also curated a number of exhibitions, including the 2011 Infinite Jest, Caricature and Satire from Leonardo to Levine, and the 2017 Mysterious Landscapes of Hercules Segers, co-organized with the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Her most recent exhibition, The Renaissance of Etching, which she co-organized with the Albertina in Vienna in 2019 to 2020, was awarded the 2020 IFPDA Foundation Book Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Orenstein.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. Really delighted to be here and to share with you what I like so much about Dutch prints, which is really my field. The title of my talk today is Rare and Everywhere, because that sums up, in a way, the vast range of prints that were produced in 17th century Holland, from the everyday to the ubiquitous to the highly desired collector's items. And counterintuitively, sometimes the most everyday and ubiquitous prints are the rarest because little effort was made to preserve them. In the 17th century, prints were everywhere. It was the way to spread the news, it was art, it was decoration. Here we have an example of a newsprint that shows the Siege of Breda, a major event in the war between Holland and Spain. So you may know that the French printmaker Jacques Callot did an enormous map of the Siege of Breda in 1627, or there's a painting by Velázquez, The Surrender of Breda in 1637. So it was a major event all around Europe. Here we have two impressions of the same print, more or less. The one on the right appears with only the central image of the one on the left. The text, which was printed separately on a different kind of press, and the text is placed in differing arrangements on both prints, as you can see. So there was not necessarily a standard way in which prints were produced in this period, very different from today. Today, if you get an edition print, every single one has to be the same. But they're changing, especially in a newsprint, like new events are happening and they've got to be ready, and print publishers in particular were the ones producing this material. You can see at the bottom, it's signed in Amsterdam by Klaas-Jans Visser. He was the major producer of this kind of material at the time, and he is trying to keep up with changing events. Natural occurrences were also recorded. So on the left is perhaps the largest and most beautifully depicted image of a beached whale on the shores of Holland in 1601, a subject depicted numerous times in print, because over several years there was a beached whale that would show up on the shores of Holland. Such beachings were clearly a major event at the time, which large numbers of people came to view. And you might be able to see in the background, there's just like loads of people parading in, coming to see this event. The beached whale itself, there are people standing on it, measuring it, and looking at it. There's even down at the bottom, over here, a honored guest who's coming. He has his little handkerchief because it stinks so much, and he's there. And then over here in the left corner is the artist who's drawing the beached whale as we see it. Up at the top, if you can see all the way up here, there are the beaching of the whale is related to other momentous natural occurrences that took place that year. So it's almost an omen of bad things that are happening. So there are eclipses of the sun and the moon, as well as an earthquake, which is a very rare occurrence in the Netherlands, and also the plague. So all up in the top of this print are there equating the beached whale with all of these other things that happened that year. On the right is an interesting print, Mezzotint, by a German artist, Johann Adam Zöppel, who depicted his sighting of a comet over his hometown of Strasbourg. The Mezzotint is inscribed, perhaps by the artist, so that you can see handwriting at the top. It says, zu Strasbourg also gesehen worden, so as seen in Strasbourg. And obviously, fewer lights in Strasbourg than there are today, so they can see the comets very well. I tried to see the last comet that came over a few weeks ago, could not see it at all. Here's a print that depicts the firework displays that took place in various cities on the occasion of the accession to the throne of England by William and Mary. There are many prints from this period of firework displays, really wonderful. And again, like here is news events being circulated throughout Europe. Now, certain subjects would have been routinely included in the stock of 17th century print sellers. You have to think a print seller his main goal was to make money by selling prints, or a print publisher, and certain things you could specialize maybe in landscapes, you could specialize maybe in portraits, but there were certain things that you really should supply because you knew there was a ready audience who would buy them. And this is the kind of print that falls into that category. For these images of Moses and Aaron with the tablets of the law, so the 10 Commandments, were particularly popular around 1600, 1620, and seem to have been part of the standard stock of print sellers at the time. So there's one by Hendrik Goltzius, Jakob Matam, Simon Frisius, and there are many of these things. So much so that when I was working on my dissertation a long time ago, I was assembling the work of the print publisher Hendrik Hondius, who was a early 17th century publisher of prints, and he was someone who really did try to sell all different kinds of material. And so at one point I thought, why am I never finding a Moses and Aaron with the tablets of the law? And then finally I ended up in a print room in Copenhagen, and there it was. And I was so excited because, at a certain point you work on an artist for long enough, you kind of get the idea of who he is and what you expect him to do. And really that was very heartening that I knew who this guy was. But prints like that would have been probably hung in the homes of people like this. And so these are two prints of good households. On the left, you can see in the background there's even these it's not inscribed with the 10 Commandments, but they're sort of alluding to the 10 Commandments in these two tablets way at the back. And here's a good family who's enjoying a hearty dinner in a image of a good household, which was paired with the image of the bad household where people are misbehaving. On the right is a very pious family saying grace. They don't have tablets of the law on view in this room, but I am sure it was somewhere this very, religious family who have quite a lot of art. If you look closely in the back, all over their home, they have dishes on the top, they have paintings in the back, and they clearly have a very large, beautiful house and many children. And this would be the type of family who no doubt had something like that hanging on their walls. Prints could also be intimate works. So on the left is a self-portrait by the young artist Jan Lutma that we acquired recently at the Met, and it's really charming with this artist who's like drawing himself, and he's looking straight into the mirror, and really captures his concentration as he's drawing his own face. Prints could also be splashy stand-ins for paintings, like the large print of a vase of flowers engraved by Nicolas de Bruyn in the early years of the 17th century. And this is really a large print and beautiful, splashy bouquet of flowers. And I have to say, what's interesting is the flower still life, which was very popular in paintings in Holland in the 17th century, you hardly see as a subject in prints. So there's a couple of these very large prints like this from very early in the 17th century, but you really don't see too many equivalent prints after that in this period coming from Holland. And I'm guessing part of the reason is that they're not colored, and the whole thing about paintings is that the color of these flowers, and maybe these prints were hand colored at a certain point. Prints could show the surrounding countryside, which was the pride of the Dutch and their newly formed nation. These were often produced in series. So the print on the left is from a series of the months. This one is January. They also show the activities that are so associated and symbolic for the Dutch of their new republic. So ice skating you see depicted quite often, and here they're skating by image of the court in The Hague and the court building in The Hague. Also fishing is another very popular image. On the right, obviously Holland was a big shipping nation. On the right you see a ship that's docked, and it's being turned over because it's being caulked, and you can see the smoke coming off the side from the activities that they're doing. This is from a series that shows all different kinds of ships, and ships not only on the water, but ships also being repaired, and which is probably something that was going on all the time, given the vast navy and other shipping that was going on in the ports of Holland. And then here is an interesting print by the one on the bottom by Klaas-Jans Visser, which shows a view of Amsterdam from part of from the north bank of the Ij, which is the body of water. If you go to Holland now, it's right by the train station. Anyway, you see in the foreground the Maid of Amsterdam in the center here, and then on both sides are like people from the world coming to honor her with gifts. So on the right, though, you see some Dutch people who are bringing in cheeses, or here's a milkmaid with cheeses. They're bringing fish. They're bringing other things that are really associated with Holland. On the other hand, over here are foreigners bringing gold, bringing, here's some people with reindeer and camels and all kinds of exotic things coming to Holland. And Amsterdam really was this center where so many parts of the world came together. And in the back, you can see all the ships that are docked, especially if you look in the back over here on the left, like a huge number of ships, and then the city of Amsterdam right in the back. What you see on the top is actually what the print looked like originally. So there was an artist named Peter Bast who made a view of Amsterdam around 1601, and at that point it was Amsterdam was beginning to grow, but was nothing like it was about 10 years later, because it just became the center of trade for Europe. And then what Klaas-Jans Visser, the etcher who did the one on the bottom, did is he got a hold of that printing plate on the top, and then he reworked it completely. So you can see this ship here on the left is the same ship that you see here on the left. This ship here is the same ship on the right that you see here, but he's added 2 extra sheets on either side, on over here and over here on the left and right, and he's just gone over the whole entire view to really bring Holland and Amsterdam up to date. There were certain monuments in the outskirts of Haarlem and Amsterdam that were sketched by almost every landscape artist of that moment, and they really became symbolic of a national history that the Dutch were constructing and reclaiming following their war of independence from Spain. So, for example, Brederode Castle, which is the castle you see here, was a 14th century castle that had not been inhabited since the early 16th century and was progressively falling into ruin. And it became sort of this romantic symbol of Holland's past. It was outside of the town of Haarlem. On the left, the artist has even depicted an elegantly dressed couple who have come to view the ruins, and there they are, the tourists. They are down in the lower right. But print after print shows the Castle Brederode and in different states of disrepair. So prints were produced in large numbers, and many of them from this period have survived because so many people at the time owned and collected prints. And here on the left is a portrait of an artist and his wife in the foreground. And you see in the foreground, you see an album with prints. Hopefully you can see it here. Prints and drawings in it, an essential element of an artist's studio at the time. On the left, or on the right, is a typical Dutch still life with books, a globe, musical instruments, and a printed portrait of the 17th century author and artist Jacob Cats, which is hanging off the table here in the foreground. And Jacob Cats was a famous poet and famous writer, but also an artist. On the right side of the painting, under the book, a skull peeks out to remind the viewer that while life is short, art lives on. People hung prints on their walls. On the left is a beautiful painting by Vermeer with a map of the Netherlands hanging on the wall behind the woman. And Vermeer also often uses this idea of putting maps on the back walls of his paintings. In the painting on the right, this woman stands next to a printed portrait of a remonstrant preacher, Simon Episcopius, that's hung on the wall near her. So she must be like a devout remonstrant, and then she's standing next to a portrait of her preacher, who she follows. In the same way, like someone in the early, in the 19th century might have had a picture of George Washington on their wall. What you can see, though, is that the prints aren't framed. They're hung from these rollers, and that was very typical of very nice prints. They either would be nailed or pasted to the wall or hung on these rollers where they would be less chance of getting damaged. Some prints were created for practical purposes, and of course, those have not survived in as great abundance. For example, in the wonderful portrait at the Met of a musician and his daughter by the Dutch portraitist Thomas de Keyser, the lute case of the musician is lined clearly with decorative prints. Many types of boxes were decorated with prints. The ones that survived most consistently are this sort of box in which merchants would house their scales and their weights. And you can see each one of these boxes has a different print pasted into the front cover. But you get chests that are entirely covered with prints, all kinds of things. People use prints for wallpaper. Prints were everywhere, but of course, as you can see, like these things, if the box gets destroyed or gets water damaged or something, the print gets destroyed as well. Collectors of all sorts compiled large collections of prints. This painting by a Flemish artist shows an ideal collection of a 17th century nobleman. It's not a real collection. His friends are visiting and admiring his collection. Paintings line the walls, as you can see in the background. A table at the back on the left is filled with small sculptures. On the table in the foreground by the open window, with a monkey at the window, we find many objects, including a globe, measuring tools, and sheets with drawings, as well as an album of prints. Although the scene here is invented, the painting tells us something of how prints were collected and housed in that period, that often they were pasted into albums. And here we have two actual albums from the 17th century that have survived and show us how prints were collected and also how they were organized, usually by subject matter. So as on the left, you see an album with landscape prints. Sometimes you would get prints by mythological prints, an album of portraits, religious scenes. There is a wonderful sort of private collection in Germany that really dates. It's in a castle. It dates from the 17th century, and you can go, if you get permission, go to look through their collection, and it's albums just like this that are, holy pictures. There's one of just images of the Virgin. There's one of just prints of kings, and just organized in that way. And then always there are albums that focus on one particular artist. So on the right, you see an album at the Met that's just prints by and after or in the circle of Parmigianino. But you could get an album of Rembrandt prints or an album of prints after Raphael. That was very typical of print collections in this time. In these two examples, you can see how tightly the prints were arranged on the page. Prints were usually printed with large margins of paper around them, but one rarely finds old master prints with large margins anymore, because the prints were so often cut down in order to fit as many pieces as possible onto an album page, as you can see they've done here. So, of course, we have to thank the practice of keeping prints in albums for the survival of so many works on paper, because much of the reason that these works still survives is that they were pasted into albums. So you can see how well these prints were pasted down. Often, when you're looking at old master prints, you see that the corners have come apart or are missing or have been filled in with a new piece of paper. That's because often in the albums they were pasted down in the four corners, and when the thing came out of the album, the corners stayed in the album. In the early decades of the 17th century, the northern Netherlands came to its own as a prosperous artistic center, and in particular, it became the most important center for producing prints in Europe. One of the reasons for this is that in the 1570s and 80s, numerous artists had fled north from the southern Netherlands during the war with Spain. Among the immigrants to the United Provinces were many involved in the print trade, engravers, publishers, printers, who were fleeing war and the strict censorship that had been imposed by the Spanish governors in the southern Netherlands. So the Netherlands also became a major center, at the same time, the Netherlands was also becoming a major center for shipping and trade, replacing the port of Antwerp, which had waned in importance. So as shipping was significant for circulating prints around the world, this was a great place for prints to be circulated all around the world. By the time Rembrandt began making prints in the late 1620s, the United Provinces, and in particular the cities of Amsterdam and Haarlem, had really replaced Antwerp as the centers for production and selling of prints of all kinds. So you see here, so prints were sold in shops. And here are images of two important ones. On the left, the shop of the 16th century Antwerp publisher Hieronymus Koch, whose publishing house was called Aux Quatre Vents, and he had famous printmakers working for him, famous painters working for him. Peter Bruegel, he published all of the prints after Bruegel. Franz Flores, who was another major figure of 16th century, he specialized in really high quality prints for a kind of intellectual audience. He was most important print publisher in Europe of his day. So here you actually see him standing here in front of his shop, and in the back you see his wife, Volken Dirks, who's manning the store in the background. Now he was a print publisher, but it is unlikely that he had actual printing presses on site. He probably contracted out with different engravers. He had quite a number of them working for him, and they would be doing the printing in other places, and then he would he would pair them up with painters. The engravers would do prints after those artists' work, and then they would be sold here in the shop. And here you might be able to see the sign for the shop, which has the number 4 and then vent, so au quatre vents, the 4 winds. On the right is the shop of the famous map and atlas maker Jodocus Hondius. Hondius, hond in Dutch, is dog, and you might see the sign of his shop here is a dog whose paw is on a globe, and his shop was called the Wakkere Hond, the vigilant dog. And it was located in Dam Square. If you've been to Amsterdam, you might have seen the Town Hall of Amsterdam in Dam Square. That's exactly what we're looking at. This is the Town Hall in the background. And then over here on the left is the street, the Kalverstraat, which now is a big shopping street. But at the time, that was really the center of all of the print sellers, print publishers at the time. It was very well located because you weren't far off from the docks. So there were a lot of people circulating. This was the main center, obviously, with the town hall. Everybody was there from all around the world. That was a great place to have your shop. The print publisher Hendrik Hondius, who I worked on, was active in The Hague. Very different kind of place. It's still very different from Amsterdam. Now it's the capital of Holland, and it was at that time the court center of Holland. And it was also the seat of the United Provinces and the court of the stadholders. This would have been more what we're seeing now is a print by an artist named Simon Frisius, but it was published by my publisher, Hendrik Hondius, and this is more or less the view from his shop. So you can see he was very well placed to get the people from the court, which is right here in the back right. And also you can see all of these people who are going by. There's some other little shops here in the foreground or on the left, but just loads of people from vendors and he has a milkmaid to like members of the court on horseback going by. So this was particularly well situated, and he was a very successful print publisher. From a busy center of trade like Amsterdam, prints were then shipped and sold throughout Europe. And here is a stand in the castle at Prague where prints are being sold. So it was part of a big market, but there was always a print seller. Prints were often shipped to be sold at the Frankfurt Book Fair. The Frankfurt Fair was held twice a year and was the most important fair for printed books, as it still is today. And our publishers from the Met go down to the Frankfurt Book Fair every year to market the books that are coming out. But in those days, they also marketed prints. In this case, the engraver of these two prints, part of a series of 12 apostles, created a series of engravings that he was intending to sell there. And so it's interesting that printmakers are actually making prints that they are planning on shipping to the Frankfurt Book Fair. These are two prints from the series entitled The 12 Apostles and St. Paul, and in a letter to a friend, De Gein, the printmaker, wrote of his intention to have the series ready for the fair, and humorously wrote the following: "I will complete them in about a month for their pilgrimage to Frankfurt, which fortunately will have to take place in the summer since they have no shoes on their feet." A little 17th century humor. Prints were shipped to the New World. Vivid evidence of this practice comes to us from a late 16th century shipwreck. In May 1596, Willem Barents and Jacob van Heemskerk launched an expedition from Holland to find a northern passage to China. Unfortunately, the two ships that set out on that expedition both ended up stuck in the northern ice, and the crew had to spend 10 months stranded on the island of Nova Zembla, which is this island here, like a little bit north of Norway and Russia, and somewhere in the Arctic. And their expedition, so they eventually were able to return home, but they had to leave behind on the island most of their belongings. But their expedition was so famous in the 17th century that many books were published about them. So you can see here some of the illustrations to these books. This is the ship getting stuck in the ice in the upper left. And then in the bottom right, an image of what their home, the house that they built on this deserted island looked like. I mean, they were able to survive because they had these ships that had been stocked for this passage to China, so they had quite a lot of things, but they also had to kill seals and bears and things to survive. Anyway, it was like a real a big bestseller in the early 17th century. And then here on the right is actually what Nova Zembla looks like now, and this is the remains of their house that they spent the winter in. But what's interesting for us is in 1871, 275 years later, a Dutch expedition went back to Nova Zembla and found the objects that had been left behind, including numerous prints. So this is what had been on their ship, and they left them behind when they came back to Holland. The Nova Zembla finds were given to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and they still have them today. As you can see in the photo on the left, that shows the museum's display of this material in the 1960s, the piles of prints that had been on board the ship had melded together in big packs. So you can see, like within this display of candlesticks, there's like huge packs of just fused paper. And that's thanks to years of sitting in melting and refreezing snow and ice. In the mid-1970s, the Rijksmuseum undertook a project to separate the prints, and you can see the results on the right. Not in great shape. The one on the top doesn't come from the group. That's a print in our collection, just to show you what the print looks like. But it shows that individual works were not being sent, but rather numerous impressions of particular prints were no doubt meant for sale in far-off locations. So this is a print by that same artist with the 12 Apostles, Jacques de Heinz, and this is an image of a lion, and you might say, well, why is so many pictures of lions being sent to China? Well, the lion was the symbol of Holland in the 17th century, so this is clearly a very nationalistic image for the Dutch. So we should just take Oh, you didn't. I just wanted to show you a little bit how etchings are made, because we're about to talk about two of the most experimental etchers of the 17th century. And this is a feature that's on the Met website, and we go through lots of different techniques, but this is one about etching. So for those of you who are not taking the class, where I hear they've learned all about etching, this is just a little reminder. Those are the tools of etching. So in etching, you take a copper plate, and you cover it with a substance that's called the ground, and that is what is being done right here. It's a kind of waxy substance that protects the metal on the copper plate. And I'm going to go through this quickly, but you can find this on the Met website if you just look up on our catalog etching. Every etching in the Met online catalog has this feature down at the bottom, or a link to the feature. Then you draw your print with a tool through the ground. So here it's just basically scratching away all of the ground and leaving it open for the next step. The next step is you put it in acid. And so the acid eats away at all of the lines that have just been uncovered and doesn't eat away at any of the lines that have been covered with the ground. Then you wipe away the ground. So here she's cleaning off the copper plate, taking all the ground off. So that reveals now the etched lines that are going to be printed. And then, of course, there's text that explains everything. Now she's inking the printing plate. And if you notice, putting ink all over the plate, but then working the ink into the lines that have just been etched and wiping off the ink from everywhere else on the printing plate. And this is a useful thing to keep in mind when we talk about Rembrandt. And then finally, the etching plate is put into the press. And presto, there's your print. So just as a reminder for people who may not be familiar with print, hard to see in this image, but final print is in reverse of the image that the artist was actually working on the printing plate. Okay, let me get back to our story. All right. So, Rembrandt is probably, so now we're going to talk about two of the most, so we were talking about the everywhere, and those prints are actually, in a certain sense, often rarer than the prints we're going to talk about now, which are what I would call the rare prints. And these are the artistic prints that were being done in Holland at the same time. And here we're going to talk about two of the most experimental printmakers of the time, Hercules Sagers and Rembrandt. And so I was showing you until now like the professional prints that were being done in this period. Now we're going to look at the things that were not, the other side of printmaking. Now, while Rembrandt is probably best known for his paintings, in his day, Rembrandt was also known for his prints, and I would argue that Rembrandt was really more of a graphic artist at heart than he was a painter. I know people will argue with me. But it was in prints that he made some of his most intimate and experimental images. And I should say that artists that I speak to today, often say they love making prints because they work through a lot of problems that then come out later in paintings that they make. And more than anywhere else, Rembrandt's creativity played out on the printing plate. Rembrandt never traveled abroad, but his reputation in this medium stretched throughout Europe in his day, and his prints were known and collected as far as Italy not long after they were made. And these works were and among the people who appreciated his works were artists like Giovanni Benedetto Castiglione, who was a printmaker in Genoa, who clearly looked at Rembrandt. I'm sure Guercino knew his work, and quite a lot of people in Italy and other places knew Rembrandt's work at the time. As you may know, Rembrandt taught a large number of pupils and apprentices to paint and draw in his style, and there's endless books about distinguishing what parts of Rembrandt's paintings were done by his pupils as opposed to what was done by him, which drawings were done by pupils as opposed to what drawings were done by him. Like the pupils imitated his style so closely that is still people are still trying to figure out what really was done by Rembrandt himself and what was done by his pupils. Printmaking, however, seems to have occupied a very different place in Rembrandt's career. Very few of his pupils ever made prints, and only one of his pupils, the artist whose work you see on the right, Ferdinand Boll, seems to have worked closely with the master and created a number of prints that relate to his style. So here is the only one in which Boll really tried to simulate the dark and rich effects that he had seen in Rembrandt's prints of the 1640s. But Boll is really an outlier, so you can see he's almost clearly imitating the composition of Rembrandt's prints. He changed the subject matter. He's putting a Holy Family in a dark interior, and the other Rembrandt made a St. Jerome, but it's clearly this setup with the light coming in from one window and in an almost entirely dark interior. But most of Rembrandt's pupils had little interest in making prints, or they made a very few. This suggests to me that in contrast to painting and drawing, this medium was something very personal and private for the artist, and it's not something he did with all of his students. So what was so special about Rembrandt as a printmaker? By the time Rembrandt became interested in prints in the early years of his career, the United Provinces was on its way to becoming a powerhouse in the field of printmaking. It was the center for this production, and with the most talented printmakers in Europe living there. It's hardly surprising that an ambitious painter like Rembrandt would want to try to make prints, but he quite quickly took a very different approach to printmaking than, let's say, his peers like Peter Paul Rubens, the other major painter of that moment, who hired a workshop of printmakers to produce prints after his paintings. Rembrandt tried this once or twice, but he, I think, quite quickly realized it was not his thing. Now, Rembrandt was, in contrast, a highly creative and intuitive printmaker. He really pushed the boundaries of printmaking and really dove into the etching technique and tried to figure out how he could get the most out of it. His free artistic spirit manifested itself right from the beginning. He did not follow the rules, and some of the characteristic aspects of printmaking that we see in young Rembrandt's work remained in his prints throughout his career. So here are 3 tiny self-portraits that he made in the late 1620s and early 1630s when he was just starting out. And he used their self-portraits, but maybe he was using himself because he didn't have other models available. The prints are tiny, a bit larger than the size of a large postage stamp, and they're slightly messy. Rembrandt puzzled with one question right from the beginning. In a medium where you can only make images in black and white, how can you draw out the details from the darkest shadows? So when a face is almost entirely in shadow, how can you show the eyes and the cheek, for instance? In each one of these works, he casts a dark shadow, which is an unusual thing, over a face, like so dark that you can hardly see the details, while the rest of the face is in bright light. So his question is, how can you bring out the eyes in these very dark areas? And you can see in each one of these prints, he's trying to figure out how to do that. And this is something that you see throughout his career. By the 1630s, in the self-portrait on the left, created just a few years later than the small self-portraits, we can see Rembrandt is puzzling out the same problem. He again puts his face entirely in shadow. And now he's become more skilled, though, in how to distinguish the figures on the face. In this print, he places almost the entire face in shadow, and just a little bit of the cheek and the earlobe are lit. But you can distinguish the eyes and the other features. In this famous print of the Three Trees from 1643, 10 years later, it seems to me the three trees are given exactly the same approach, where the front is all in shadow and it's being lit from behind. So it's like something he keeps puzzling out throughout his career. So in the Adoration of Shepherds, another 10 years or 15 years later, he's reached an even more developed level of understanding how to create such prints. The scene is entirely dark and is lit only by a lantern in the center and an unseen candle that is situated on the right behind the figure of Joseph, who is using it to read a book. One source of light is in the center, the other one is hidden. Clearly, the challenge Rembrandt set for himself here was the following. How do these light sources illuminate the details throughout the scene, especially the group of onlookers on the and animals on the left? So if you look closely, you can see here's a cow. There's all kinds of heads here. And each one is illuminated differently depending on how close they are to the source of light. And what I love is there's one little figure back here where you can see just his nose is white, but the rest of his face is in shadow. So it's like the protuberances on your face are lit, but the rest of your face is not. One way that he devised to create such effects that was quite unusual for printmaking at the time is that Rembrandt inked his prints differently in different impressions. So that was, we saw the ink, you ink a printing plate, you wipe off the ink, but he actually left ink on the printing plate. So here are two impressions of the flight into Egypt, a late print of 1651. On the left, the plate is cleanly wiped, and you can see all the lines of the white paper. So that's just the way the print would have been printed in a standard way. But on the right, our impression at the Met is an interestingly inked impression. Instead of wiping the surface of the plate clean, he left ink on the surface. So Mary on the ass is further from the source of light, which is this lantern that's held by Joseph. So she is really very much in the dark. The right side of her is more in shadow than the left side of her, which is closer to the source of light. And as you progressively get closer to the source of light, the whole scene lightens up. And then, hard to see maybe in this photo, but when you look at the print in real life, he's actually, the facets of this lantern have really been wiped very clean. So that's like brilliant light coming from the lantern, and then the light is getting more dim as he goes further out. But he experimented, and each impression that he made of this print, he painted differently. So here are 5 examples of the same exact print, but hopefully you can see, like, each one is slightly different. So he's making little printed paintings, and the one on the bottom right, almost completely dark. That lantern is not doing very much for the scene, but you can see, like, the one in the on the upper row in the middle, that lantern is really quite bright. So each one, he's just trying things out, and that's the way he worked. It's like he didn't like doing the same thing over and over again, each thing slightly different. A novel aspect of printmaking that Rembrandt employed right from the start was to produce etchings in many states. So every time an artist made a change to their printing plate, we call it a state change. Every artist, over the course of working on a print, makes state changes to check how the work is progressing. State changes are useful for assessing when a particular impression might have been made, because if it is an impression of the 5th state, we know that it was printed after the impressions of the 2nd state. So that's why there are many catalogs made listing all the states of particular artists' prints. It's important if you're thinking of buying a Rembrandt print to know that if it is an early impression or a later one, because the prices can vary vastly. Rembrandt somewhat uniquely kept the proof impressions of different states and even printed numerous impressions of early states. He would also work on a print, finish it, and then make changes and finish it again. And that's what we see here. So this is an early print, but he's doing this even early on. So here on the left is a portrait of this man. You can see that he works on it, works on a little bit more. He signs it here in the center on the top, his monogram. Then he cuts the plate down because he wants to get rid of all of this kind of weird etching lines all around, which are probably covering over something from an earlier version of this print. Then he works on the print a little more, and then the one in the bottom left, he signs it again. So every time you sign something, you figure that's a finished print. So he keeps working on these things over and over and over again. Most famously, this method of finishing a print and then taking up the plate again and dramatically reworking continued throughout his career. He did this with the print of the Christ crucified between two thieves, which is more commonly known as the Three Crosses. The print dates towards the end of his career, and on the left is an impression of the first state of the print. This impression at the Met is printed on vellum or parchment. And here he depicted the moment when Christ has died on the cross. And to the right of the cross, Mary has fainted. And to the left are the centurions on horseback. At a certain point, the printing plate was wearing down, and he did this plate entirely in dry point, which is a technique where you scratch the surface of a printing plate, and it picks up all of these little bits of copper that, when printed, print as this very rich, velvety effect we call the burr. But that only lasts for about maybe 15 impressions, and then you got to do something. So his plate clearly was wearing down, and what he decided to do was, instead of just going over some lines, making them stronger, he decided to do a whole new image. So he wiped out pretty much most of the composition. So everybody in the foreground has come out. He's changed now a lot of the figures in this print in the fourth state, and what he did was just even change the moment being depicted, because that was something he liked to do. He would like to take, a Holy Family flight into Egypt and then start drawing and making images of all the different moments of the scene. He loved looking at people and bringing out, the sort of human emotion in images, and this is what he does here. So here, whereas on the left, in the first state, Christ has just died. On the right, if you look very carefully at the print, Christ is actually alive, and his mouth is open and his eyes are open. And so this is a scene right before he dies on the cross. And then here are details from the first state and from the fourth state, and you can see how dramatically he has reworked exactly the same spots on the print, and that's just typical of this artist. What I love is the upper right corner, this detail of Mary who faints at the cross, at the bottom of the cross. They're supposed to be, the figures are bathed in bright light, so they're really almost stick figures, but you can see he's someone who had drawn people and looked at people so often that just as stick figures, you can understand exactly the emotion of what all of these people are doing. Finally, the other thing that Rembrandt does is print on different kinds of supports. So we saw that he printed on vellum just now. So another thing that he did was print on Japan paper, and this was paper that was coming from the Far East on ships coming into Amsterdam, where he lived, and he loved it. He liked vellum, and he liked Japan paper because some of this paper doesn't soak up the ink in the same way, and it also has a kind of golden tone. So I think for his effects of the burr from the dry point, it really heightened this kind of dark, rich effect. And also, he could vary the prints in that way with the different kinds of paper. So on the left, the Japan paper has a bit of a golden tone, so it could evoke, it seems, when you see it in real life, it's a little bit like it's the end of the day, the sun is going down, it's sort of melancholy, whereas on the right is just regular white laid paper, and it just has a very different, brighter effect. And so he liked to vary his prints in that way. Now, the other artists we're going to talk about, so Rembrandt was always looking at earlier artists, and he almost had like a composition or competition, even with artists who had died, a century ago. He was still like looking at their work, like, how can I do better? What can I do? But, he clearly appreciated what they had done, but like he wanted to build on that. And one of the artists he really looked at very hard was Hercules Sagers. Now, the two artists were very opposite characters, and while there is clear evidence in Rembrandt's prints that he was looking at Sagers' work, we're not sure whether they ever met, but they were certainly alive at the same time. They might have, Sagers was older than Rembrandt. They might have overlapped in 1631 in Amsterdam when Sagers was in the process of leaving the city. Rembrandt had just arrived in the city. They might also have met a few years later when Sagers was living in The Hague and Rembrandt was carrying out some commissions there, but we don't know for sure. I should say that Sagers' work is extremely rare. There are only 10 impressions of his prints in US museums, and the Met has one. There were also small groups in Paris, London, and Dresden. That's because the bulk of his work lives in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where they have over 100 pieces, and hopefully some of you might have seen the exhibition that we did a few years ago of his work, which was really an eye-opener and a great moment. Most likely, Sagers' work was still with him. Clearly, he was not selling these prints to a large public. He had them most, we're guessing he still had most of them with him when he died, and he died in poverty. And it seems to have been acquired following his death in large groups by two collectors, and both of those collections eventually were given to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Now, Rembrandt's life and career is much better documented than that of Sagers. We know a lot about Rembrandt's activities, personal relationships, even what he looked like at many different moments of his life, thanks to his voluminous artwork and the many documents that have survived. Lots of people knew Rembrandt. Sagers, in contrast, remains somewhat of a mystery. He was older than Rembrandt, but we still can only estimate the dates of the artist's birth and death. The little archival documentation about his life that exists suggests that Sagers was also active as an art dealer before he ran into financial troubles around 1631, which appear to have forced him to sell his house in Amsterdam and leave the city. Another source about the artist mentions of him by the art theorist Samuel van Hoogstraten in his book published in 1678. Hoogstraten was a pupil of Rembrandt, so clearly, I would guess Hoogstraten knew about Sagers from Rembrandt. Van Hoogstraten cites Sagers as an example of an artist of great genius who is unrecognized during his lifetime and dies in poverty. Rembrandt clearly knew and admired Sagers' work. He owned at least 8 paintings by the artist. The inventory of Rembrandt's insolvent estate, compiled in 1656 when Rembrandt declared bankruptcy, lists paintings by Sagers in several rooms of the artist's house. A small landscape by Hercules Sagers in the entrance hall, a small group of trees by Hercules Sagers, and some small houses by Hercules Sagers in the antechamber. 2 small landscapes by Hercules Sagers in the room behind the antechamber, a large landscape by Hercules Sagers, and a landscape in grisaille by Hercules Sagers in the room behind the parlor, and a small landscape by Hercules Sagers in the antechamber of the art room. Rembrandt also owned, and it doesn't mention any prints, but it's pretty clear he must have owned prints by Sagers. Rembrandt also owned 1 printing plate, and that we know for sure. Because, as you can see here on the slide, on the left is the print by Hercules Sagers of Tobias and the Angel. And then, oops, I keep doing that. On the right is Rembrandt's reworking of Hercules Sagers' printing plate. So, as we saw with Klaas-Jan Visscher reworking the view of Amsterdam by Peter Bast, same thing happened here. Rembrandt got a hold of Hercules Sagers' printing plate and reworked it. So you can see the landscape hasn't changed all that much. He added some lines in the foreground, but he actually changed the subject matter. So instead of Tobias and the Angel, he made it a flight into Egypt, one of his favorite subjects. Segers copied the figures in his print from an earlier print by a Dutch engraver named Hendrik Goudt, Goudt, after the German painter Adam Elsheimer. And you can see he pretty much faithfully copied these figures. Most of Segers' prints are landscapes without any figures, so I can see why he relied on this print when he wanted to draw some figures in his subject. Rembrandt clearly had a very wide knowledge of prints in his period. Recognizing Segers' source, a print by Goudt after Elsheimer, made reference to his figures to so he knew Segers had used those figures from that print, so he picked a different print by Goudt after Elsheimer to reference when he reworked Segers' plate. So it's sort of like, sparring with the person that came before you. So here he has this flight into Egypt, which clearly is coming from this other print by Goudt after Elsheimer, the flight into Egypt. And so you can see he really admired Segers, but also is a little bit of, kind of poking him a little. Segers, as I mentioned, was a true eccentric. This is more typical of the sort of prints that he made. He really came up with the idea that we already saw with Rembrandt of making impressions of a print into varied miniature paintings. So while we see Rembrandt as this creative inventor, actually some of the things that he was doing were coming directly from Hercules Segers. Here we see an impression of the landscape called the Enclosed Valley. It's unusually printed in brown ink on colored paper, or I think actually this may be on canvas. Very unusual at the time to use colored inks and to print on paper or canvas that has been colored. But what is even more unusual, and this is exactly the same print, all of these different ones. But what he did was he really was making miniature paintings. So he was taking exactly the same print, printing it in different colors, sometimes blue, sometimes green, sometimes black, sometimes brown, and then he would paint each of the prints, impressions of the prints, differently. So here on the left, the middle one on the left, kind of a foggy day. On the upper right in the center, maybe early morning with that pink sky. On the two on the bottom on the left, sort of cloudy, this kind of green, murky image. And then the one on the bottom, very dark green, really beautiful. And that's really fascinating to see this artist trying to pull different images out of the same exact printing plate. Here again, not only is he making the same print in various different colors, so you can see on the left it's all in shades of blue, on the right green, and then on the bottom is the impression we have at the Met, where he actually cut the print down on both sides, but then paints it in this really beautiful way. He puts clouds in the sky. I mean, it's really one of the most gorgeous prints up close. But you can see he is very much like Rembrandt. Like, what can I do? How can I do it differently? Unfortunately, he did not have the public that Rembrandt did to sell all these things to, and they seem to not have gone very far. He also invented a new technique, which was not used again till the 18th century, which is sugar lift. So sugar lift etching is ends up being more like painting on the printing plate. So you can see that these images really are more painterly. They're not hard lines. They're painting on, and then the paper that he's using he's painted in this kind of different gradings of color from blue to pink. Like really beautiful, evocative prints. Some people look at these and say, oh, was he looking at Japanese prints? But as far as we know, there was nothing like that, or Chinese prints. There was nothing like that available to him in Amsterdam in that period. So this is really him doing his own thing. So here we have the two most creative, eccentric, intuitive printmakers of the 17th century. While Rembrandt seems a bit eccentric and out-of-the-box thinker, when his prints are compared with Sagers' work, Rembrandt really comes out as the one steeped in tradition, sticking to making black and white prints on white paper, mostly, while Sagers goes off in his own direction and really breaks all the rules. Sagers' extraordinary etchings no doubt inspired Rembrandt to push his own even further, using the techniques that he already knew. We should also leave open the possibility that if the two artists did meet when their careers coincided in Amsterdam in 1631 and The Hague in 1633, that Sagers might have taken ideas from Rembrandt as well. Rembrandt must have recognized in the messy, idiosyncratic, and unorthodox artist a kindred spirit. One can only imagine the conversation that may have taken place between the two. Thank you.
I think we have time for just a couple of questions. Anyone have a question? All right, hands up.
Yeah. Are there any original plates in existence? Like, would that
the actual copper plates? Yes. So for Rembrandt, 80 copper plates were like preserved. I mean, his prints were reprinted till the early 20th century, and those plates were put on the market, I think in the 90s, maybe early 90s, came on the market, and quite a lot of museums and collectors bought the Rembrandt's printing plates. So if you print them now, they don't look like what he made originally because they've been so worn down, but they're kind of like iconic, Rembrandt held this. That's sort of
the value goes down, or and if you were presented with a copy or how would you determine?
Are you talking about prints on paper or the copper plate?
On paper.
Well, that's a whole thing. The value of prints has to do with the condition. Certainly a first state often is more valuable than a fifth state. Since Rembrandt's prints were printed long after he died, there are a lot of posthumous, prints made after his death, so you have to consider that. You have to take in a lot of things into consideration, so it's hard to say, like, this is the kind of print you should buy, because for each print, it's a slightly different situation. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr.
All right,
Orenstein.
you're
Please
welcome.
join me in the round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you.